Welcome back to episode 82. In this episode, I am with Gus Bottazzi. I think I said that right. Gus, I originally met him the first time I did the Nir Maman seminar, as Gus was kind enough to host, not Nir seminar, Nir Maman instructor course, where Gus was kind enough to hold it at his school then in Connecticut. And Gus has over 30 years martial arts experience and holds multiple black belts. Now, before I get into that, I should remind everyone that this podcast is brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions since 2013. So if you like this content of this podcast or whatever else I decide to put out on the internet, and you would like to support us, there are many ways you can do that. The free ones are, of course, like and share our posts at Urban Tactics Krav Maga on Instagram. Like and share our posts on Facebook at Urban Tactics Krav Maga. You can, of course, check us out on our blog. Like and share our posts at UTKMblog.com. Sometimes it's me writing, sometimes it's not. It depends. UTKMblog.com also has basic Krav Maga principles as I teach them, and link to UTKMU, which is another area that you can support us, which is if you want to see how I've structured my curriculum and the way I teach a curriculum, you can pay to access our beginner and novice curriculum. And as Gus pointed out at one point, Krav Maga is not about creating anything new. It's about refining it, making it more effective. So if the way I teach Krav Maga helps your Krav Maga journey, no matter what organization you're with, then I'm more than happy to help you with that. So you can go to utkmu.com and sign up for beginner or novice packages. No commitment, it's month to month, or if you want to pay for a year, you can do that. You can also go to utkmblog.com, hit the support us, and you can donate if you would like to. Just do a one-time or monthly or yearly donation on the support us page. The more time I have for content, the less time I have to do other stuff, which means better content. So the more support I have, the more I can do that. And of course, for my local listeners in Metro Vancouver, don't forget I do teach the firearms safety courses to get your firearms license, the PAL license. So you can sign up for that at urbantacticskm.com, which is also where you can sign up for regular classes once we can all do that unhindered. Urbantacticskm.com, again, is where you can sort of see our website for the local training. I believe that is it. Oh, the other thing is, shameless plug, if you are bored, most certainly you're bored or drunk, and you want something else to watch that isn't Krav Maga or politically laced rantings from myself that often happen on this podcast, you can check out my and my partner's new YouTube channel, Joe and John Do Stuff. So creative, I know. It's basically us doing things from renovations, cooking, to whatever. So like and subscribe that, because I think that for me, at least, self-defense is so much more than just physical. It's about learning how to survive life. And I think actually that is one of the reasons I went with the title Urban Tactics for our company. Was I wanted to give you as more and more of the population move towards urban populations, we're losing skill sets, and I wanted to give you the skills you need to survive in life. So that could be from physical self-defense, mental self-defense. That's the stuff I cover on the blog. And then there's just how do you do things, from cooking to renovations, etc. We're just going to put it out there because I want to give you skill sets in an entertaining way that's a little different. You get to see my sense of humor, at least. So if you want to and you're bored or drunk, either is fine, go to our me and my partner's new YouTube channel, Joe and John Do Stuff. That would also be very good to support this podcast because, again, the more income I have coming in from all sorts of places, the more content I can provide for you, whether it be self-defense expertise, general mental health wellness tips, or whatever. Look forward to all that. So those are all the ways that you can support us. Again, don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe to our social media, Urban Tactics Krav Maga or Urban Tactics KM, depending on the platform. The blog, utkmblog.com, and our local website, urbantacticskm.com. especially if you want regular classes. Okay, so Gus, his website, if you want to check him out, is corporatekravmaga.com. And he is currently doing private lessons specifically. And I'll read, at this time, he's no longer doing his group classes at his school. But let's read a little bit of Gus according to his website. So Gus Bottazzi is a 30-year veteran of martial arts, holding multiple black belts in Japanese karate and Israeli Krav Maga. He has the distinction of training with and promoted to full instructor and black belt by 3 direct students of IMI. So IMI Lichtenfeld is the founder of modern Krav Maga, and Gus has been given a black belt by 3 different people who all train directly with IMI. And he's certified through 4 of the most respected Krav Maga federations in the world: Krav Maga Worldwide, IKMA, IKMAC, Krav Maga Academy. And he's sought after. He's a sought after self-defense instructor and strategy speaker. Gus has given workshops and seminars internationally to audiences ranging from law enforcement to women's empowerment organizations. Over the last 15 years, Gus has designed and implemented a training program and methodology that has been taught to thousands of college-bound students. Gus's mission is to help reduce the number of victims of violent crimes every day, to instill knowledge and self-defense in all students. He teaches and builds confidence necessary to stay vigilant and stay safe. So that is off of his website, corporatekravmaga.com. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is, what does good Krav Maga look like? What does good self-defense look like? What should people be learning in their training? What does bad Krav Maga or self-defense look like? These are all topics that we discuss because I don't know what's going on the internet, but a lot of people are shitting on Krav Maga right now. I'm wondering, I had a thought, if it's to do with the fact that everyone hates Israel and all these martial arts are just taking their anti-Israel, anti-Semitic ideology and going after Krav Maga nowadays. Now, granted, we both agree, me and Gus, that there's a lot of garbage Krav Maga out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the schools that do really well are absolute crap because they don't understand what it is they're teaching. And the reality is, if you're teaching Krav Maga properly, you're often teaching things that people need, not that they want, which is a challenge. We discussed that at one point, how people often don't want to talk about the realities of violence and how it's uncomfortable, and that how if you talk to people or train in a way with people, that is the case, and it doesn't have that happy-go-lucky, got your sweat on feeling. It's people aren't drawn to it because real violence is shitty, and training for real violence is sometimes shitty. And you're not always going to feel great about yourself. But remember, the goal is to train your ability to deal with the reality of being surprised in a self-defense situations. It's, I think, one of the criticisms of Krav Maga is it's hard to train for real life under stress, which is true and not true. Is if I'm training for MMA, I'm training for MMA. We're training the most effective techniques that we can. But we're not dealing with what happens if you're caught completely off guard mentally or physically. It doesn't always work the same. So that's a large part of what we're talking about, the differences in methodology, how to approach it, etc. So enjoy this podcast. It's episode 82 with Gus Bottazzi. Krav Maga is not just a self-defense system. It is a way of life. Warriors Den is a podcast for Kravists, fighters, martial artists, warriors, politicians, and general citizens. Consider this. The society that separates scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Lucidity. Your host, Jonathan Fader, talks to guests in an open and uncensored format about their fights, their philosophies, and their lives. No topic is taboo, and the conversation may start in one place and end in another. As the quote suggests, you cannot separate the warrior from the politics and the world around them, as a true warrior must be a student in all forms of art and science.
You're listening to The Warrior's Day. Brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions.
Welcome back. I am here with Gus Bottazzi, who's been doing martial arts Krav Maga for 30-something years now. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great too. I've already taught today, so now I'm here doing this and continuing with that journey. So,
Nice.
how do you did you start with Krav Maga or did you start with something else?
Started with Japanese karate, actually Kempo.
Kempo.
And yeah, funny story. I had made it a New Year's resolution that I was going to get into the martial arts and make my way all the way to black belt.
Yeah.
Quite literally, at December 31st, I'm going to go do this. And about a week later, I'm in a restaurant downstairs of a two-story building, and there's all this banging going on upstairs. So I call the waiter over. I'm like, "What is all that? Is that construction?" He goes, "No, that's a karate studio."
Yeah.
And I said, "No kidding." And he said, "Yeah." So I went upstairs and I met the instructor, and I spent 14 years learning Japanese karate. Got the third degree black belt.
Yeah. Now, is Kempo karate really Japanese, or were you learning like the because isn't it from Hawaii originally, I believe?
As it was introduced to me, and again, as will be no surprise, there's a lot of politics in martial
Yeah.
arts. So there's always some politics in martial arts. So what you find is there's Japanese roots with Chinese undertones, and um, what I found out that this federation split from that federation, and they
Yeah.
were doing the true stuff. So um, I'll say that it was black belt up to black belt. It was Japanese, and then they started going into really Chinese kung fu,
Mm.
and that was sort of their curriculum. So
Yeah.
I followed it that way, but I couldn't tell you if it was specifically Japanese. I will say that I've met a lot of other guys in the Japanese karate world, and we've compared forms, and the forms I was learning were their forms too. So
Yeah.
I assume there's similarities.
Yeah, I would imagine so. People always forget that we have two arms, two legs, and a head, and there's only so much creativity you can get with
Right.
regards to martial arts until
Amen.
we evolve, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you did Kempo for you said 14 years.
Yep.
Did you introduce other martial arts, or did you sort of get bored with that and then move into other stuff?
I'm a cross trainer, just in my mindset. So I'll learn a set of skills, and I'm like, well, judo does some interesting stuff. So I played with judo for a couple of years, and then
Mm.
I wanted to improve my striking. So I did, Western boxing for a couple of years, and
Yeah.
so it's always been a journey. Every little art I would go into or investigate a little bit would just be to how do I improve this side of my game versus that side of my game. Even in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been cross training in Salat just because
Mm.
I think the ways they approach trapping and maneuvering the body are interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So where does Krav Maga come in?
So another fun story.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm a third degree black belt, and I'm doing fine. I'm teaching for my instructor when he's away, and I'm living a very comfortable life, learning at a very slow pace at that point because there wasn't much more in curriculum for me to be pursuing under him. And my son at this point is 10 years old at a middle school, and they have a health fair at his school. And one of the tables at the health fair was a Krav Maga table,
Yeah.
of all things. And my son wanted to go because he wanted to hang with his buds. I'm like, well, let me go see what's around here. And there's Krav Maga. And this guy says, hey, why don't you come in and try what I do? And I'd heard of it. And I said, well, sure, let me see. So I bow into a class the following week, and again, not to sound immodest or anything, but I was a good third degree black belt. I knew my stuff, and they paired me off with a guy that had 6 months of Krav Maga experience,
Yeah.
and this guy handled me.
Mm.
And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? How does this happen?
Yeah.
So I started getting more into this understanding of what is karate doing, what's karate doing, and being the type A guy that I am, I just jumped
Yeah.
full body into the ocean. Hmm.
That's good. That's the way it is. Usually people, they love it. They just dive in one way or the other. Um,
Yep,
Now you're on the East Coast, right?
I am.
Because you're Connecticut or New York. Are you specific to one? Because I see you're in both sometimes.
I have studios in two locations. I have one in Connecticut and one in actually Westchester, New York.
Yeah.
So I train in both facilities.
So how long have you been teaching Krav Maga then, since that experience?
I have been teaching Krav Maga probably since 2008.
2008. That's about when I started, I think. So we were
Yeah.
similar time frames. you have obviously
Mhm.
a longer experience with martial arts. I always found it like East Coast is interesting. Like I'm West Coast Canada, and I found that there is a very distinct martial arts culture on the East Coast, like martial arts symposiums, and that was a very foreign concept to me, where all the masters of different styles get together. So what's your perspective on like the martial arts, not just Krav Maga, but martial arts culture on the East Coast? Like, what's been your sort of experience there?
It's very cluttered.
Mm.
So you'll see a lot of symposiums is probably a good way of saying it.
Yeah,
Courses, weekend courses, workshops, seminars, and everyone kind of gets together to kind of figure out the best technique for this particular situation or problem, or and they'll they'll talk back and forth about it. So it's pretty cool, but like I said earlier, it's political.
yeah,
So
lots of politics.
you tend to find that people will kind of hang together who are part of the same system, and they kind of trash talk the other systems a little bit when they're together. So that's
Yeah, I mean that's the
sadly
human
how it
way,
happens.
right? Yeah. So uh so I was up early. My train of thought's already gone. Um, What were you with a specific organization of Krav Maga, and are you still with them, or are you kind of solo like a lot of people do these days?
So my journey has started with Krav Maga Worldwide, which
Hmm.
is out of Los Angeles, and that's where
Yeah.
I got my first 3 to 4 years of training. While I was at a worldwide place, there was a seminar given that I attended by David Kahn and
Mm.
Alan Feldman at the time,
Yeah.
and they represent IKMA,
Yeah.
which was, as we both know, the original federation under EME.
Yeah.
So I sat through that 4 hour seminar, and I was blown away by what they were doing. And
Yeah.
again, I hate to say better or worse, let's just say different. But I walked out of that seminar and I followed Alan Feldman to the parking lot, and I just went to him. I said, I want to train with you.
Yeah.
Um, where do you train? And he told me. And for the next 5 years, I pursued IKMA exclusively. So I went between Alan and David Kahn,
Yeah.
and ultimately Rick Blitzstein, another
Mhm.
IKMA individual. So I spent a lot of time under those three guys. So
Yeah.
I would say if you saw, the bulk of my work comes from that. And then I found out about this super cool guy called Nir Maiman,
Yeah.
and and what he was doing with himself with CT 707. I thought, well, I want to learn that.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I'm not with any one federation. So what I've done is I've sort of taken on my own flavor of Krav Maga. Not that
Yeah.
I've invented anything, but my teaching methodology has become sort of a combination of all of it.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm in the same boat because I started with IKMF, and then as you start branching out and you start learning, like, oh, like I like this better and I like that better, and
Yeah.
I think that is in the spirit of what Imi wanted. I had never met the
Mm-hmm.
guy, unfortunately. Is that you go from the first principles, and what works over here doesn't work over there, and what's the best concept. And right, I think actually the near seminar we did at your place in Connecticut, I think that was the first time I trained with him as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually, whether he calls it that or not, he teaches from a very first principles perspective, right? Because let's say some of the other organizations, if I go look at their curriculum list, they have like 1,000 techniques.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Ridiculous.
I don't have time to teach to a reasonable proficiency the average person, right? So that really changed my mind as well, as like, what benefit do I get from being with one of these big organizations if I don't need to
Mm-hmm.
teach all that stuff? And I think you're finding this across North America,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of people are actually distancing themselves from the big organizations. And I don't know about you, but I have started to notice a trend right now on the internet. It's time for everyone to bash Krav Maga. I'm seeing a
Yeah.
lot of it right now for whatever reason. Now, I think you're in an interesting perspective because you did all the traditional martial arts, and then you had an eye-opening experience with Krav Maga,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe you have a perspective about why people are saying what they're saying and why Krav Maga works or does not work, because you have everything in there.
It's an interesting time, right? I think so. Here's how I come at it. When I teach from the standpoint of what does what are the best self-defense principles for this moment, right? So let's talk about self-defense.
Yeah.
Let's forget about system work. Let's forget about Krav or karate or Salat or any other system, and say, what's the whole definition of self-defense, right? And the definition of self-defense is to get yourself out of a dangerous situation as quickly as possible with as little damage to you. That's self-defense.
Yeah.
So what you want to start talking about is what's the quickest way out of a situation. Now, when I'm looking at all these YouTube videos and all these Instagram podcasts or whatnot, I mean, again, there's some brand names out there that are not saying some nice stuff about what Krav Maga is.
Yeah.
And I think, they're taking isolated techniques and they're deconstructing a technique, saying this technique doesn't show smart ideas. And I think, you need to start looking at the conversation as far as not every technique is meant to be analyzed, but as you said before, it's the principles. What are we trying to do, and how do we best get ourselves out of the situation with minimum damage to us and as quickly as possible? So I think that Krav Maga, if it's viewed from that filter, does very well. But if we're going to sit there and talk about, okay, we're going to look at 16 different answers for a gun or a knife or whatever, everyone is going to have their own reason as to why theirs is best. And the real answer comes, sadly, is how non-compliant is the moment. A lot of the times that people are trying to make theirs sound better, I look at the videos and the attacker doesn't really do much other than stand there and take a beating.
Yeah.
The Krav Maga way of training, as I've had it, as I'm sure you've had it, you're fighting, right? There's a lot more resistance. There's a lot more non-compliance. I've been bruised and punched and bloodied, in part of my practice, because if it doesn't work under some of those conditions, then it probably doesn't work.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Like, I think Krav Maga needs to be focused less on the techniques, although we'll agree that some techniques work better than others, and more on like the approach to the teaching methodology. Because if you look at Army Krav Maga in Israel, is technically, from a technical perspective, actually isn't very good. They focus on the aggression and the fight and the go and the go and the go and don't give up, based on like the prey, predator prey mentality. Is you either fight or flight, which is our ingrained thing. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that, and they get so focused on the technique specific, they don't even understand why you're doing it, right? So let's take the 360, right? I know some organizations don't teach it anymore, and some organizations do. I still do, and I look at it, I think a lot of people are just teaching it wrong because they don't actually understand it, right, off of the flinch response. Whereas if I'm panicking, I shoot my arms out. Well, if you're trained and you're paying attention, you should back away because you're like, no, I'm ready for this. But I think the point you made about its self-defense is a lot of people forget they're not expecting it when it happens, and their nervous system is caught off guard. And then your flinch response goes, and we're just kind of like working with it. And then I need to add the aggression to overwhelm their nervous system. But if I just teach it as a technique, 360 is kind of shitty. But if I teach it as the whole thing, it makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I totally agree with you, and it's funny you should talk about the mindset, because there was an attack in Paris a few years ago. I don't remember how long ago, but I used it as a teaching point for my classes for probably a week.
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of people at a Parisian cafe at night having whatever, coffee and dessert, or late night dinners, and a bunch of guys broke into the place with machetes and started attacking people up. Do you remember that attack?
There's been so many in the last few years. I don't remember that specific one.
But it was a bizarre moment, and I use that moment a lot as an example, because if you imagine yourself sitting with, whether it's your wife or your girlfriend or your family or whomever, and you're just sitting down having your cafe au lait and your pastry for dessert, and you're probably had a couple of nice glasses of wine and you're feeling relaxed, the last thing you're ready for is a machete attack or any attack, because you're not there. Your mindset isn't there. And to go from 0 to 100 is a lot to ask. So my methodology when I teach is I remind people, I said, I don't want you to remember at that point a specific technique. That's almost impossible. But what I do want you to think about is these are your movement patterns. These are your overall macro objectives, right? And that's something you might be able to pull off.
Yeah.
That's what you want to get to, because you're correct. If I'm not thinking about it, I'll pull out a flinch. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
whole spear system, right? Spear system's
Yeah.
all about the outside 90,
Yeah.
and I get that, and I think that's a fine concept. But you know, 360 by itself works as a model, but not as
Yeah.
a technique.
Yeah. So it's like the holistic, the technique plus the mindset plus the ability to apply. It's like what I teach is I've started actually connecting it to mental health a lot lately because that's big in the conversation, and I'm just trying to make people realize your nervous system, whether you're in combat or a mental health crisis, is actually doing the same thing. And if I can start to
Right.
make people realize to take control over how they're feeling in a moment of stress, it'll apply to both a physical self-defense or, my boss is yelling at me again. And it's kind
Right.
of
Right.
like taking control of yourself. Because I think people really under or overestimate their ability to perform when they get that adrenaline dump and things start going sideways and they're in a situation where I was not expecting that guy to pull a knife at all, right?
So, funny story. Just 2 weeks ago, I took on a new client,
Mm,
and this client was unknowingly to him in a knife fight, and I say that exactly as I meant it. He was in a fight because his friend, who's an MMA cage fighter, pro, but in one of the minor promotions, with
mm.
a winning record, I think he's like 7-1.
It's pretty
Gets
good
into,
though.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's fine, man. That's good.
Yeah.
So he gets into some kind of verbal jawing with some guy at a bar, and they get pushing and they get shoving, and the MMA guy figured he's got this guy licked. So I think he throws one or two shots at him, and the guy who he's handling suddenly pulls a knife out from his pocket because he didn't start with the knife in his hand,
Yeah.
and he smashes this MMA guy across his eyes, chest, and stomach.
Oh yeah.
And the MMA guy ends up on the floor, kind of in a bloody mess. He lives, but he's all messed up.
Yeah.
And my new client found himself suddenly trying to help his friend out, not understanding that there was a knife in this guy's hand because it was a small profile weapon. And he
Yeah.
gets slashed across the side of the neck. He doesn't die, obviously, but the expectation sets that people have for violence, I think, are completely rooted in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Everyone sees all of these sequences that sound and look good, and there's every bit of awareness of all things at all times. And I always tell people that violence is chaos. That's all
Yeah.
violence is, and all self-defense is trying to find a few moments of structure during a chaotic moment.
That's a really good way of putting it. I think that defining a few moments of structure. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed and panic. And perspective is everything. Unfortunately, Hollywood does its thing, and as some
Mm-hmm.
places get safer and safer, like the suburbs, in some places, people are detached from violence, and then they only think what they see on TV is the reality. And I had an interesting thing. It's not a shocker to me at all. I'm teaching at a sort of an interesting university sort of situation where it's foreign exchange students doing like semester abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Hilariously, I had a kid from Syria, like Iran, countries that traditionally don't like Israel. So I'm like, okay, this will be interesting. It turned out fine. And then I had, the teacher, super nice guy, a very Canadian. And, I am talking about the Canadian laws of like, hey, you need to understand the laws and you can't just beat the crap out of people outright here. It has to be reasonable. But I was saying to someone about like, what do you do in a violent situation? And the kid from Syria responded with, you get your friends and you show force or something along those lines. And I'm like, you know what?
Right.
You're absolutely correct in your culture. If I say that in Canada, though, people are like, what are you talking about? You're just ego driven. But
Yeah.
people forget the culture is if I don't do that in some places, they will then beat me up because it's the perceptional of
Right.
violence, which changes from where you are and what's going on. So if you live in Vancouver, where I am, it's very relatively safe, though there's a mild gang war here right now, but I'm not at all concerned. And then you have New York, right? What's going on
Mm-hmm.
in New York right now, right?
Sure.
Which I would
Sure.
certainly love to talk about.
Yeah.
The violence is getting a little crazy there. It seems like, at least from what I'm seeing. I don't know. You're there. You can tell me more.
Um, yeah, I mean, there's certainly events. There are pockets of violence everywhere there, but I will tell you, my daughter lives in New York. My parents live in New York, and
Yeah.
they don't see any of it. So I
Yeah.
think it depends on where you are. But to your point earlier about laws, it's not a small detail how you affect or what you decide to do.
Yeah.
No understanding what the laws allow for,
Mm.
because in New York, actually in the entire tri-state, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, the requirement is preclusion, right? So basically, preclusion says I'm not allowed to be fighting if I can leave. If I can leave, I got to go. That's the
Yeah.
requirement.
Yeah.
So if I decide that I'm going to fight the person when I had opportunity to leave, it's no longer deemed self-defense, and I have to now, deal with the criminal possibilities of what I do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's it's versus, let's say, Florida or Texas or the southern states where it's stand your ground, which
Yeah.
basically says as soon as I have a problem in front of me, I have every right to deal with them as I need to.
Yeah.
And what not everyone understands is in the United States, 38 of the 50 are stand your ground,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the 12
And
are not.
increasingly, as I think pushback to the radical left is no permit states for carries now. You're starting to see that pop up, which is
Right.
interesting. Now, you being in New York, the carrying a firearm for self-defense is a big no-no. But what are
Or
your
not.
thoughts? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Like as an American, because I hear all sorts of perspectives on that one.
I don't have a problem with the Second Amendment at all. I think the idea of carrying a weapon and having a right to a weapon is fine. But I think there needs to be some common sense to how some of those things get played out. So I don't think there's enough mental health checks done on
Yeah.
people. And I think there's a lot of situations where people who should have no rights to having a gun could still get a gun.
Yeah.
And I completely understand these are certain things, but from a legislative standpoint, you can't just legislate guns. It's too hard. How do you
Yeah.
screen? What do you screen for? So it's a nightmare. But I have no issue with the Second Amendment. I think people. I live I live in a very red section of Connecticut.
Yeah.
Everybody here carries. Everybody.
Yeah.
There's guns everywhere, and I have no issue with that. But no one's not much gun violence around here. That's how
Yeah.
much I'll tell you.
So you can carry in Connecticut. You can't carry in New York, though, right?
Correct.
Yeah. It's always interesting, like in America, where one state you can and one state you can't, and then there's all the confusion with the argument of the political aspect. So I find myself, always explaining like Canadian gun laws, because on one aspect they're really good because they really do address the mental health aspect, but then
Right.
on the other side, it's used as a political tool. If you're following Canadian politics right now, they're trying to buy votes, and there's a quite a bad gang situation in Toronto going on, and they're all saying we need to ban guns. But the problem is the guns they're using are coming illegally across the border, which means our border control isn't doing something. So they're trying to hawk it off on the gun thing. So that's like the debate. Is it's like, no, we're not going to take your guns. It's like in the States, you have Democrats outright saying we're taking your guns. So there's a problem. So the knee-jerk reaction is to say, no, we're not going to take that stance. Like, you cannot touch it. But then you see all the mental health aspects, right? So in Canada, we have effectively red flag laws, essentially. Whereas if you think someone who has legal guns is a problem, you can report it and they'll investigate it. And if they find that it's a problem, they'll take it away. Until such a time where it's not an issue. So I know someone personally who had a psychotic break, and they're normally very safe with guns, and they almost shot their mother. There was a lot going on in the situation.
Wow.
The police came in and took the guns away, arrested it. He saw a mental health professional. They said, hey, you had a psychotic break. And the court then said, you have a 2-year prohibition, right?
Yeah.
So they want to give him time to calm down and establish that it was in fact a 2-year psychotic break. And then now he was told, you got to go do your gun license again because we have licensing here. And they got it. He passed all the stuff. And, he had to fight a little bit because they're like, are you sure? Like, are you sure you're fine? And he got it back. And it's a bit more of a rational approach behind the scenes, because if you talk to the politicians, they're saying different things. But the actual application is like, they assess, like, is this person a threat to themselves or others? And if so, we're not going to let them have guns. And if not, then it's fine. The problem in America is it's so polarized that people don't want to have that conversation about it, right? Because as
well, we live it right now in a powder keg political world, right? If you even breathe something that seems a bit one way or the other, and the other person in front of you is not that way, it can just end the conversation abruptly. So it's a tough conversation, and obviously gun laws are certainly heated debates. There's been so much mass shootings around here
Yeah.
since January. I don't even remember how many incidents there have been, but there have been over 100 mass shootings.
In New York or in America?
No, in the U.S. plurally,
Yes. Okay.
U.S.
Yeah.
plurally. So there's been over 100 mass shootings, in the 5 months.
Mm.
So that's certainly untenable, right? There's got to be something done about that. But the question becomes, how do you attack that, and
Yeah.
and on what basis do you attack that?
Yeah.
Because again, mental health is certainly the whole point. If someone is uh, of mental soundness, they won't think to use their gun in this kind of manner. There's certainly something wrong with that person that they decide they're going to walk into an establishment and start shooting people at random.
Yeah.
But access to the weapon is only one possible answer, but there's other aspects that they can be focusing on. And I don't think any political party, either one, has a good answer for that.
Yeah, well, because the answer is actually nothing to do with the guns, and that's why they don't want
Right.
to deal with it. It has to do with other things, such as
Right.
education. More educated a populace is, the generally, as a general rule, the less violent they tend to be. So there's that, and you have unfortunate situation of ghettoization in America due to, in air quotes, good ideas that were executed poorly, and then
Right.
nobody bothers to fix anything, and it's just an easier, I think, scapegoat. It's the same with, like violence itself. Like, well, that person shouldn't have attacked you. Yeah, but he's attacking you right now. What are you gonna do about
Right.
it?
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly right. Mm-hmm.
So, what kind? Because I'm always interested, like, who trains Krav Maga. So, like in New York, Connecticut, like, are you getting people from all walks of life, or are you getting specific sort of groups of people coming in the door?
It's well, prior to this year, let's sort of divide the world into maybe pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Hmm. Yeah.
Pre-COVID, it was all walks of life.
Yeah.
Uh, Basically, people who are I only teach adults. I don't have a kids program. I run purely with an adult crowd. And I've been getting new people who are either new parents or executives who travel a lot, or part of the C-suite, people who are just in that world. So I was getting some high net worth people who had concerns about keeping themselves and their families safe when they traveled.
Yeah.
Post COVID, I've started to find pockets of people who have been exposed to threats.
Hmm.
So the Asian community has started to show up to me a little bit more. The Jewish community has started to show up a little bit more because anti-Semitism is up. Certainly, the anti-Asian world has become far greater in the last, call it 12 to 18 months. So I'm starting to find people coming in because they're just afraid to be walking around because of the harassment that they're seeing.
Yeah. Fear is a powerful motivator, right?
It is, and now you're really dealing with the irrational, right? Because if these are all racially based concerns, there is
Yeah.
no talking your way down, right? You are the enemy because you are the enemy, and I don't know you, but because you are the persuasion of the religion that you are the enemy. So
Yeah.
at that point, the only language that you have is violence. Sadly, that's all they've got left.
That's why, I was in the last podcast I did, he brought up a quote that I love, is it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And I find, like,
Yeah.
I've found that here, in particular with the Jewish community in Canada, is they don't want to learn because they feel relatively safe. And it's like, guys, do you forget your own history? And I had students, they always joke, oh, we need something serious, like violent, to happen to get more people in the door, which is not what you want, because it's so
Nope.
hard to get people to prepare for bad situations if it's nowhere in their sort of like ethereal peripheral life.
You're right.
Yeah. Have you found an effective methodology to convince people to train even if they don't need it yet? Or are you still struggling like the rest of us?
I'm struggling, man. I tell people all the time, the number one problem I have, I think the number one problem we uh, as a group of people trying to teach have, right, an industry, is we got to make people talk about something they're uncomfortable about talking about, which is
Yeah.
violence, right?
Yeah.
Anytime you bring up violence, and I find especially this is true when you're dealing with women, the fact that I've tried to carve out women's self-defense classes and rape prevention classes and all these things, and they're very poorly attended. And I
Yeah.
have found that. And when I've talked to these communities of women and I ask them what their interests are, what you realize is they'll say things which are abjectly false, which is, well, I live in fill in the blank, Greenwich, Armonk, Fairfield, Westport. I don't need to know about that.
Yeah.
And that's just denial. They don't want to acknowledge that it could potentially happen to them. So there's a real hardship in trying to have a dialogue with somebody about something they don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
So, anytime there's a shooting or a violent action or an event that makes the news, my phone rings. And,
Yeah.
I don't want that to be the case, like you said, but that seems to be the only time it hits people's radar.
Yeah, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's like some of those like just deep-rooted psychological behaviors of humanity that get us into these problems because everyone's not learning. It's like, oh, it doesn't affect me until it does. Like there's that famous, I don't know, bishop or priest from World War II. They didn't come from me at first, and then it goes down the line of lists, and all of a sudden, now they're at my door and I'm screwed, right? And it's like a lesson that people refuse to learn. They don't want to. Right. And I don't know what to do about that at this point, where it's like you can see it coming and everyone's like, no, it's never going to happen. Okay.
Right. And it's Tim Larkin's book, right? When Violence is the Answer, he has that famous quote, which I've used several times, right? Violence is hardly the best option, but when it is, it's the only option.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you're left with that. When you're standing with the wolf at your door, you have no choice. There's no talking your way out of it. And there's a fair amount of that conversation I'll have with people as far as what you're doing and how you're trying to get by. And there are those who are receptive to it, and there are those who are just, as we just talked about, right? They just as soon not talk about it, or they'll say, "Well, I'll carry a gun. Well, I'll carry a knife. Well, I'll carry whatever," without really understanding that the act of drawing and shooting, the act of drawing and stabbing, if they decide to use a knife, they don't know what that means.
Yeah.
They've shot at targets. They've never shot at people.
Yeah.
And there's a reality, again, in my humble opinion, there's a reality that the person who's here to come for you has already made peace with the fact that they're going to kill you. Yeah. Have you made peace with the fact that you're going to kill them?
Yeah.
And that hesitation will cost you your life.
Yeah, and I think in the cities now we're so even the violent cities in North America and even in Western worlds are nothing compared to the violence in other places, and there's like a scale. Now, like I started hunting in the last few years. Yeah, I didn't grow up with it. My parents were not gun culture people. I'm the one who got into it, and I started hunting, and I haven't been doing it long enough that I don't have that like hesitation before the shot. So. That's maybe a way to help people understand is I'm shooting something I intend to eat. And even doing that without the experience or propensity for violence like that, it's like, should I do it? Should I not do it? Now imagine putting that into life or death, where you gotta do it now. Here in Canada, you cannot carry a knife for self-defense purposes. And a lot of people think you can. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, and I'll tell police the same thing about their gun. It's like, if that thing is coming out, are you actually going to use it? Because if you're not, you shouldn't be pulling it out. Now, let's forget the fact you legally can't do that in Canada, because you can go to jail simply for carrying it for that purposes under the right circumstances. If you piss them off, they'll charge you for sure. If you're like, whatever, they'll take it for you and tell you to go away. But like, that's the reality. Carrying these tools is nothing if, one, you're not willing to use it, and two, you don't have the ability to use it under stress, right? I don't want to carry stuff unless I have the authority to use it. Like in Canada, that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't carry a gun, is because if I use it for that purpose, I'm going to go to jail. So there's not, even though I think guns are necessary means of self-defense in where I am, it's like, it's not worth it. I'd rather just run, like you said, in New York, or use, if I have to, hand-to-hand combat. But if I'm in some other country, like if me as a white person is in South Africa right now, I would be carrying a gun for sure, right? Yeah. And it just depends, where you are. It's that perspective, I think.
Yeah, and the cultural differences are important, and most people don't even take the time to even consider that, because we're very parochial, right? Yeah. We'll all know our respective neighborhoods, maybe our townships or possibly our states, but we don't go beyond that. So people have a real high ignorance to what it's like to cross state borders or certainly country borders and know what it's like somewhere else. They don't do that. It's
Yeah.
again, it's you and I have dedicated a good portion of our lives to learn this,
Yeah.
and it's a very different point of view that we have than the standard John and Jane Q public, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about a jury of our peers, at least in the United States, they're not a jury of my peers,
Yeah.
and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just come at things with a far different set of ideas and understandings and appreciations than the standard person sitting in the jury box does.
Yeah. You know, that's actually I've been thinking about that is like if I killed someone in self-defense, well, I want the jury to be use of force experts because they can judge reasonably did I use excessive force or not. And now, as good as our judicial system has been to get us out of where we were, habeas corpus and all that stuff, it's like these people who don't understand violence are judging me about me using violence, but they don't understand it. And it seems like a very like I don't know what your thoughts are on the George Floyd case, but to me, that was not justice because that was a mob decision. And well, I think everyone can agree that he should never ever be a cop again. I've talked to a lot of people who just cannot consider that murder as a use of force. They don't consider it murder. They'll consider it not appropriate, and there should be repercussions. But the mob on the media is that's that was murder. And then you find out some of the jurors in the trial, they came in with the intent of conviction, which is not how the system is supposed to work.
Correct.
Well, so what are your thoughts on that whole that specific Pierce concept, also what's going on with policing in the U.S. right now?
So I think it's easy to kind of categorize police as racist. I think that's just become a habit this country has gotten into, and I don't believe it's true. I don't believe that they are any more racist as an organization as far as a percentage as you would see the percentage of racism across the country. They are a sampling of us. So are there some that are racist? Yes. Are there some that are there a lot that are not? Yes. And I think that goes across the country. What I think a lot of the brand name cases of people who have been killed by police officers is a sad example of is terrible training by police officers on how to handle on a hand-to-hand basis. They don't know how to do that. I have trained several law enforcement across the U.S., and I've realized that when it comes to just taking a suspect down with their hands and bringing him to the cuffs, they are woefully inept at doing that. So what Chauvin did, in my mind, was he applied a technique, if you want to call it that, totally inappropriately, and he just continued to hold it down for reasons that should never have lasted 9 minutes.
Yeah.
So there's
that part everyone agrees. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, right. But the technique, what he chose to do, I actually teach for law enforcement a position across the neck, but that not that portion of the neck. And actually, what I teach is across the jawline. So I go for pain, not unconscious. So I think there should be, there's this mob, to use your expression, this sort of mob mentality of defund the police. I'm the exact opposite. I think you should fund the police.
Yeah, more
give
training.
them more dollars, more training. Because God Almighty, the number of times I've seen police officers draw a gun when it's supposed to be the last measure, right? It's supposed to be physical presence, then verbal, then stick, then OC, then taser, then gun. It's the sixth choice. It's the sixth choice.
Yeah.
And what I see these officers go is they go from 0 to 6 right away. And that's because they recert in gun training twice a year. And they have not touched hand-to-hand for years, decades, some of them not since the academy.
Yeah. Well, you said a lot there I want to unpack. I'm just not sure where to start. Let's do the knee on the neck thing. So you said you teach a knee on the neck thing. I do as well, when taught appropriately. And it's similar, from that sort of standing side control where you have a shin. I teach the shin more on the neck and a neck/jaw, right, where you're turning it for alignment to control. Because even if they're really big, right, it's deep rooted into the nervous system. that if their body thinks, even though it's not, their neck is going to break, even though it's not, so that they don't resist. Now, I
Right.
teach that, but I've noticed in the Krav Maga world, self-defense, law enforcement, people just like they're giving all these reasons why they don't teach it anymore, but I know they're not teaching it because they're scared of the mob getting mad at them for teaching that technique, which they've been told by the media is a bad technique, right?
Right.
So, you know, it's interesting. You teach it, I teach it. I have no problem saying, yeah, I teach variations of neon neck because it works,
It does.
right?
It does.
But as you said, you have to be trained to do it. You also need to know when to release because you don't have it, you know, so you can
Well,
transition.
there is with any technique, especially one that requires manipulation of the body, there is precision involved.
Yeah,
There has to be precision involved, right? So if you're off, then you need to either reassess whether that's the same technique or go to a second technique.
yeah,
And I think in some cases people just jump into it and they just apply it and they figure without precision, I'll just muscle it and
yeah,
bad
which you
things
cannot.
happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
bad things happen. Hmm.
Yeah. Now, with that being said, there's one area of weakness in Krav Maga, which is grappling. Now, I've noticed
Right.
it's been picking up lately in the last few years, and I know IKMA does a lot more grappling than a lot of other organizations because teaching police requires a knowledge of grappling. Now, unfortunately,
Yep.
a lot of Krav Maga instructors grappling is garbage. Have you been
Yep.
integrating a lot of it into your like neon belly, side control, all that? How do you approach
I
grappling and
do.
teaching it?
I do from the vantage point of, so again, I try to be very I'll use the word modular.
Hmm.
So if I'm dealing with just civilians versus if I'm dealing with law enforcement, if I'm dealing with
Yeah,
law enforcement or security, air marshal, whomever, then their position of neon belly or side control is purely a function of getting the cuffs.
yeah,
So if I've got to manipulate to get the cuffs, and here's all the things I'm going to have you do. From a civilian vantage point, my vantage point is what do I need to do to get up as quickly as possible? Because I
yeah,
don't want to stay on the ground as quickly for very long because two major reasons, right? Well, three. First of all, unlike BJJ mats, concrete sucks, and to roll
yeah,
around on concrete is awful. Two, I don't know if there's going to be a second assailant that can jump in and kick me in the head. And three, I don't know if the guy I'm grappling with is suddenly going to pull out a knife and stab me.
mm,
So I don't want to hang on the ground very long. So everything I do is purely a function of trying to get up and out to a better position.
yeah,
But to our point earlier, law enforcement, they got to be able to work from that position because their position is to get them to control.
yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting, like the different approaches that Krav Maga people have come with to integrating the grappling. Like I see
Mm-hmm.
a lot of techniques even taught in Israel, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why they teach it for the ground stuff because I think you're right about that. The goal needs to be to get up, and if you're
Yep.
doing those techniques, your mind is not thinking about getting up. So
Nope.
I have a very similar approach. Is you look first. Rule number one: don't go to the ground. Rule number two: don't go to the ground. Rule number three: learn to fall to the ground because if you can't fall, you're not getting up again.
Yep.
And then learn to get up fast. And
Yep.
then and only then are you grappling for survival. At that point, things have not gone well. And if you're stuck on the ground, it's either because they're so big or they know how to grapple, right? And I encourage everyone to do wrestling and BJJ to supplement their
Absolutely.
Krav Maga always.
I tell people learning BJJ or wrestling on the ground is the same as learning footwork standing.
Yeah,
You need to know how to move your body and you need to know how to move their body. So if you have that capability, you are that much more effective in doing those things you just said about getting up and getting out.
yeah. I find like we're talking politics in the martial arts. It's like trying to explain to people like in the jujitsu community. I remember having conversation. Like I do jujitsu, I love it. I spend more time training doing that
Mm-hmm.
than a lot of other things nowadays. Um, but it's just having like that self defense conversation with them. Like it's hard sometimes to get through to them. Like yes, your technique is high percentage in the ring. I 100% agree. Like rear naked choke, very high percentage. But what purpose does that have in the self defense world as far
Yeah,
as achieving your goals, one way or the other? It can have, but it's often not appropriate. Like,
right. And it gets back to the why. Why am I
yeah,
doing this? Right.
yeah,
Just because it's people tend to fall in love with, or I'll say certain organizations tend to fall in love with certain techniques. whether it's because it's cool or because it's effective under these set of conditions. But remember, as Krav was conceived, and I was very fortunate in that Alan Feldman and Rick Blitzstein were both students of Emi's. And I trained directly with them, and they would tell me stories of here's what Emi meant when he said this or taught this, and here are the stories he would tell. So I got a lot of those little cool, little behind the scenes stories of the 1981 instructor course that took place in Netanya. And if the smallest person in the room can't effectively do this on the biggest person in the room, it stopped being taught. It wasn't meant to be taught, and that's what people lose track of. So then, I have a lot of guys, and sadly or whatever, I'm mostly guys that train with me, and I try to encourage women to train with me, and I have women, but it's probably 80% men, 20% women. And what I find is that guys will pair off with guys of similar size, and they'll work on them, and they'll do all these things, and I'll go, guys, that's great, but if you tack on 100 pounds to the guy who was your partner, how would that work?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I had a instructor certification for another organization because I just wanted to expand my portfolio. And my partner for the entire 5 days, 6'5", 375, and I'm 6'1", 220.
Yeah.
So he's got 150 pounds on me and about 3 inches on me.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, that's a wall of person that you're trying to move around. Right. So that's a test, right? It's a test to see does the principles of this technique make sense? Does the why still apply? And that's something I always try to emphasize.
Yeah, the size thing is interesting and also hard for people to kind of get their head around, because a guy that size, a lot of techniques are gonna fail. It doesn't matter whether it works on most people; it's gonna fail. That's why I tell people you can't cheat physics, but you can cheat it with biology. So if I actually reset his nervous system with a groin strike, great, there's my chance. If I catch him in the eye, there's my chance. But a lot of the other stuff, other than me resetting his nervous system somehow, is not gonna work. So you'll get the 100-pound girls that come in and they're like, it just isn't working for me. And I'm like, you're right. You need to develop your skill level to the point where you can compensate for the size difference. And people hate hearing that. It's like, you mean I got to train more? I was like, yep. Because I think that, I take the bell curve sort of approach. You're going to get the 10% of people who are the athletes, and I could teach them anything. It's going to work for them. And then you get the bottom 10% where it's like, hey, your self-defenses don't get in fights. And then everybody else in the middle, these techniques will work more or less for you most of the time. But then I also say, in the end of the day, doesn't matter what system you're doing, techniques will fail at a certain point. And that's why you revert to your principles. Because now you're like, I don't know what to do. So I'll tell them, if you're panicking, you don't know what to do, groin or head. Just get that. And you can get enough of a reset, hopefully, that you can find that escape. People don't like to admit, because the whole sort of, woke, happy-go-lucky lefty culture is never tell people that they can't do something. And I'm like, dude, they're 100 pounds, they're 250. There are certain limitations we need to accept.
Yeah, and one of the things I remind people of, and this goes back to what you were saying before about just, military Krav Maga in Israel, some of it's just raw aggression.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to turn on the animal. And you are going to have to, go at them in a almost a primal way, and technique will certainly be important. I had the pleasure of, or the privilege, I should say, of training a guy who's a special ops Marine, and he's a sniper. And he and I he did 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he's the real thing. He's legit. And we talked about that. I said, so tell me what the whole point is. Like, what's the mental that they teach you in special ops?
Yeah.
And it's simple. He goes, first 1 to 100 wins.
Yeah.
And I think that's an overlooked conversation. I think we want to get technical and we want to give principles, and I think that's always important, and you have to do those things, and that's the basis of the system. But at some point, you're not going to just sit there and very casually hit a person in the eye or kick a person in the groin. You're going to have to move and act as aggressively as if your life was depending on it, because it does. And again, that's not something that everyone is comfortable with.
Yeah, especially in North America. Like I always tell people, like I have a very when I first started teaching, I was very like, ah, like this, and then I'm teaching in Vancouver, right? And then it's like I toned it down over the years because I want longevity out of my students. And the other thing is, like you can ask my students the testing. It like I break people in the testing, and I tell them, if you get injured in the test, you gotta finish, otherwise I'm not passing you. But
Yeah,
in training if you get hurt enough, yeah, you can sit down. It's fine.
of course.
I'm just getting North Americans that didn't grow up in a rough neighborhood to
Hmm.
be aggressive and realize that it's okay to be violent if you need it is a very tough thing sometimes. How have you been approaching that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny, I try to, I kind of go through a progression. So I'll teach techniques and I'll teach them as far as this is how it works, and this is how it works in a static way. And then by the end of class, working it dynamically and dynamic with aggression and non-compliance.
Well,
And you start to see things fall apart, and then
yeah,
people just give up. They go, oh, it's not working, and they throw their hands in the air. I say, well, you stopped working. It
yeah,
didn't stop working. You stopped working.
yeah,
and and I have to build people into this world of you're going to have to get sweaty and you're going to be roughed up a little bit. And I do a lot of privates. I do about 28 privates a week.
oh, it's
And
a lot.
yeah, it's 28 privates a week. And I will pull out the boxing gloves, and when we're doing stuff on the ground, I will tell them that until they actually do something to me that make me stop, I am going to punch them in the face,
Yeah,
and I will continue to punch them in the face. Now they're 16-ounce gloves, but
yeah,
I'm still punching them.
yeah,
And I had a student of mine who we were working a certain process on the ground, and I got into his mount and I was banging on him and banging on him and banging on him, and you know he finally brought me in, and he literally took his thumb and rammed it into my eye. I mean, legitimately
yeah,
rammed it into my eye, to my point where I just put both hands in the air and rolled away because that was
yeah,
just too much pain to contend with. And I said, well, yeah, you got the point of it now.
yeah,
But until I ramped it up to that, it was it was a color by numbers class, right? It
yeah,
was I'm going to do this and you're going to do this. I'm like, well, no, you have to earn that moment. You didn't earn it, and
yeah.
you're correct. North Americans are very soft in that regard.
And I think like that is to me what the like good Krav Maga training is. Is we're training that nervous system response. You basically had to make that guy literally feel like he's so overwhelmed for him
Right.
to react.
Yep.
That's how I know it's work when I that's how I can tell when students are getting it because you know what if they're being overwhelmed and they're just like covering, I know their nervous system isn't in the point where can actually handle it versus the students who've been around or individuals who've experienced, life, let's say, they just go, right? And there's a
Yeah.
huge difference. Like I did a drill the other day. I need to do it more. I always forget to do the fun drills sometimes because we get in our routine. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
do 360, you doing the knives and stuff. My other instructor is like, hey, we really need to do the white T-shirt marker pen thing,
Yeah.
and we're doing the exact same techniques, and all of a sudden, I'm noticing it's expected, of course, that everyone nervous system is through the roof now. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, they're seeing, the marks where they normally don't see anything, and all of a sudden, the people who have no problem with aggression, they're acting like it's a real thing now, and all
Yep.
of a sudden, the people who aren't used to an overwhelmed nervous system are panicking, and just changing the parameters enough like that to give them a visual cue, all of a sudden you start to see who is trained enough that they could survive and who needs more training because they're panicking still, right? And I think that's what the internet is missing about Krav Maga is that
Hmm.
aspect of it.
Well, Krav Maga didn't invent anything. Again, if
Yeah.
we're going to really take a hard look at ourselves and be honest, we didn't invent any one technique so much. We didn't invent any striking, that's for sure.
Mm.
Our methodology for training is more aggressive, and we try to build more of that sense of life or death. And again, weapon work is certainly where we specialize, but it's the
Yeah.
same premise. Your red marker drill is my shock knife drill.
Yeah.
So I got shock knives.
Yeah.
So it's that big, and everyone, as soon as they hear that, man, their adrenaline starts to go. It's not even a bad shock, but nobody wants it.
I would
And
have shock knives. Unfortunately, there's a situation where they're not illegal here. However, I
Mhm.
feel like the RCMP has scared the living crap out of the business that sells them, and they refuse to
Right.
sell them to anyone in Canada that isn't law enforcement or military. But there's no ban on them, so it's like one of those weird, like,
Interesting.
can I get my shock knife, guys? No, why not?
Yeah.
Because I've played with them once or twice because I had friends who had them, but they're an effective tool to a point, though, because if you get used to them and you're like, you don't fear it anymore,
Oh,
you know.
I totally agree with you. Well, so I have a fun story. So Rick Blitzstein, he have you ever trained with Rick?
No, I've never met him,
Rick
unfortunately.
Rick again is one of Amy's students,
Yeah,
and he trains people out of Miami. And he doesn't have a studio. He actually trains people on the corner by a beach.
yeah,
That's if it's a pretty day, it's training day. If it's a bad day, he's not training anybody.
yeah,
So he was working a class outside, and there's a park bench that's overlooking what they're doing. There's this old Korean guy sort of sitting there watching him, and he's got his dog. And Rick's happened to be working a knife class, and Rick is watching this guy sort of, look at it and kind of nod and shake his head a little bit. And, he's obviously got some opinions on what he was doing. So Rick
mm,
goes over and asks the guy, says, do you know knife work? He goes, yeah, I learned it in the Korean Army.
mm,
He said, really? He said, do you have any points of view on this? He goes, well, basically no one's acting with any level of urgency. They're not treating the knife like a knife. They're
yeah,
treating, they're all plastic rubber knives, the stuff we've all seen. So he says, do you mind if I step into the class for a second? And Rick says, no, by all means, please do. So the guy takes the knife that Rick's holding,
mm,
and remind you, he's outdoors, and he walks around and he finds a pile of dog shit,
yeah,
and he rubs the knife in the dog shit.
yeah,
And boy, oh boy, nobody wanted to be touched by that. It gave an
yeah,
entirely different new feel to not having that knife come anywhere near them.
yeah,
And I remember that story because I remember that's a realistic way of thinking. Not that I'm going to start doing that in my own house, but the premise that says you got to make their experience less pleasant, right? If I
yeah,
get a rubber knife into my chest or my shoulder, I don't think about it. I'm like, oh, oops. But
yeah,
I didn't really move with any level of concern because there was never any real risk to me. So
yeah.
yeah, it's important.
Yeah, and it's two things. Like, you need to get people to realize it's life or death, but also at the simultaneously, particularly in North America with like insurance and all that, the you got to keep people safe. And so, for
Yep.
an example, is occasionally I get a big, strong student or someone who had a rough life, and their nervous system goes like boom as soon as we start doing anything, and then they just start messing up other students, and no one wants to play with them. So it's like a fine game. How do you like train people so they understand that they can get that reaction that they need without killing each other?
Right.
Which I think is why that myth of like, oh, these techniques are too deadly to train, which is nonsense. It's just learn to be a good training partner. Like, it's
Yeah.
but there's definitely something to say. You want to break those patterns, because even in Krav, if you're just doing the same, an overhead knife and it's always the same and you don't change it up, um, people get overwhelmed, and then it defeats the purpose of the training. But that's dog shit is an interesting way to do it, I think.
It worked.
Yeah, and then I think like so. Israel being the source, and the sort of traditional ideology of Krav Maga is it's the special forces. I always like to remind people that if you're in special forces, physically speaking and potentially mentally, you are the top tier of human beings. And
Yes.
how I teach you is going to be very different than to the person who can barely move their body, because you have to
Right.
like build people up. And I think a lot of the bravos around Krav Maga is that a lot of the top instructors, at least in Israel, are so used to training the best of the best physically, and
Hmm.
they don't know how to necessarily build a program,
Right.
building someone from nothing, right?
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
I agree, and I think that's one of those things where a true instructor is going to be able to evaluate what they have and modify how they teach based on the abilities the person you know standing in front of them has.
Yeah,
Again, another quote I was taught by Alan Feldman that Emi said goes, you don't change to fit Krav Maga changes to fit you,
yeah,
and that's always been the philosophy. But you're right, if you're used to just training the best of the best, and those who are already emotionally and psychologically committed to the fight, you have an advantage. People
Yeah.
who I train, civilians, right? We'll just talk about my people. These people have some of these people have never been in a fight in their entire lives.
Yeah.
They have no idea what it's like. They fear a fight, rightfully, but they don't even have a perspective on what it feels like to be hit.
Mm.
I had one guy who was a extreme skier, so he'd go helicopter skiing in the Alps and do all these crazy CrossFit kind of things. He was jacked in all manners. So he came and trained with me for a little while, and we're working inside defenses and outside defenses, and I'm chucking punches at him, like I mean them.
Yeah.
And at one point, he kind of misses the block, but I pulled it just about an inch from his face. I knew I was about to clock him, and he goes, "Wow, that was close." He goes, "I've never been punched before."
Yeah.
Now he's in his 40s. So I said to him, I said, "Well, the most liberating thing you'll ever find is I will punch you in the face someday, not intentionally, in the sense of it'll be part of a drill and you'll miss, and you'll realize it didn't kill you, and that'll be the most liberating moment of your life."
Yeah.
He bowed out of that class and never came back.
Yeah. That's
Never came back.
I've had a situation like that. Is I was teaching at a university, which I generally don't like to do anymore because I can't stand the culture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but this kid, I was demonstrating something, and he, I don't know, decided to be a smartass, and I'm just like, he knew what I was showing. I'm like just sort of guiding it, and he flinched and in a very aggressive way, and I ended up hitting him in the face, and he'd never been hit before, and his immediate response was. I pulled my punch, but I still made contact, and he just like covered his face and just like sat down
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
never came back. And it's like
Yeah.
that, that is why in my school I require sparring. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
turn people into MMA fighters, kickboxers, and
Mm-hmm.
the sparring looks nothing like the technical stuff, but it's to
No.
do with that mental development. Like I want you to be able to get hit and hit. I want you to know
Yeah.
how you can move and how to know your ranges. And I know there's a lot of Krav Maga schools that don't do sparring, and I just don't know how you can run a school like that in the modern world. You
Well, yeah, I have people sparring. I have
yeah,
sparring classes on Sundays, and I tell people it's as important as anything else to know that you can take a hit and give a hit.
yeah,
And it's something else as simple as that. And I tell them, you're not going to go for technical perfection. You're not
yeah,
going to sit there and execute all these great things that you do in a drill because it's free flow, right? Just free form. But if in the process of doing this you get hit or kicked or whatever, and you're able to gather your mind and come back, well, that already is a skill that you need to have in a real violent moment. So
yeah.
it's worth the price of admission.
Yeah. Well, it's like you mentioned the spear system. I haven't trained with him yet. COVID threw a lot of my plans off, but he always talks about fear, and overcoming fear. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's what it is. Because if you're like a suburb person who's never experienced violence, never been hit, and then all
Right.
of a sudden you get hit, it's going to overwhelm your nervous system. And
Right.
I've been thinking about like PTSD and explaining it to some people. It's like just because something bad happened you doesn't mean you have trauma, but where the trauma comes is for your experience. It's so overwhelming that you don't know what to do with it. And the example is like World War I shell shock. Before we
Right.
started looking into it, well, can you imagine being a farmer taking care of goats and sheeps in a
Right.
peaceful, quiet village, birds every morning?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this craziest thing that happens is someone new visits town, and then all of a sudden you're in a war with guns and tanks, which you've never heard of or thought of before, and artillery, which is conceptually disastrous for you. And you can look at the videos of someone who's shell shocked, and it was
Right.
just such an overwhelming experience. Like shell shock even is worse than a lot of people have experienced like modern PTSD, because it's just the concept of the war in that
Mm-hmm.
way is so beyond what they could handle, and they just were fried. And so that's why I talk about like the nervous system a lot. Is if your nervous system can't handle violence, you will be easily overwhelmed, right? And that's one of my goals with students, is to make them realize what they can and cannot handle before they get overwhelmed. So time to run. Would you
Yeah.
approach like
Uh,
that?
yeah, I totally think so. I think it's the psychology of violence is as important as understanding the actual tactical of violence, and
Yeah.
being able to understand what's going on in front of you and understanding how to deal with whether it's the first shot, whether someone just sucker punched you, or even if someone's standing in front of you just grabbing you by the shoulders and shaking you.
Yeah.
That's a hugely distressing moment for many people, and being able to formulate a thought, what do I do now, is as much an organization of the brain as it is an understanding of the technique.
Yeah.
So you gotta overcome the oh shit, if you will. This is now really happening. My God, it's really happening. And
Yeah.
then once you're past that OSM, as they say, that oh shit moment, once you're past the OSM, you're now in a place where you got to now do something. So I totally agree with you. It's part of training, right? 14 years of karate, no disrespect to the system at all, or to the art of karate as a martial art. At no point did it ever translate the forms of the techniques towards a violent moment. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
It never did. Other than some very light sparring that was point sparring, and even that was low risk. There was no injury.
Yeah.
You didn't have a point of view as to when would I ever use this. So the stories you hear, at least in the U.S., I'm sure it's globally, of these black belts in whatever system getting their butts handed to them in a bar, is not surprising to me. And it's not because black belts are meaningless, but unless you can translate what you're learning on the mats to what's happening in front of you, it's almost extraneous information. They don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. That reminds me of a story one of my students told me once. So they'd been doing judo for a long portion of their life, and judo is a great base to have as a martial art compared to some other stuff. And he had been doing Krav Maga for, I don't know, like 6 months, a year, 2 years, I don't know, whatever it was. And someone like jokingly snuck up on him at his car, and his immediate response was to turn and like hands up right away. And he said to me after that, he's like, all the years of judo that I had, I would never respond like that
Right.
if something surprised me. And all of a sudden, after a little bit of Krav Maga, I actually responded in a way that would put me in a position to be able to defend myself. Right?
Yeah.
Nothing against judo. Judo is one of the better overall martial arts. But it was just like that. If you're only training for competition and you're not caught off guard, because if we're going into a prepared fight where I know I'm going into it, we're both standing there, okay, we're ready to fight, my mind's in a place, versus that like, what's happening? That oh shit, like I gotta go now, right?
Yeah, it's a whole other mindset. I talk about you being in Krav mode versus being in relax mode. You're in Krav mode, yeah. I know what I'm going to do. I have that Rolodex open, right?
Yeah.
Everything in my brain about fighting is already open. I'm thinking about all those things. I leave the mats. I go grab my cup of coffee, and I'm off living my life. I'm not thinking about that stuff.
Yeah.
And then how I react is a whole other discussion. I had a funny moment to play out probably about 10 years ago. I was at a diner right off the Merritt Parkway, which is like a big highway off Connecticut. And I'm just sitting there at the counter having my eggs and the coffee, and I'm not paying attention. I'm by myself. I'm not paying attention to anything. And without knowing this is happening, one of my students walks in and sneaks up behind me and throws me into a rear naked choke.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't announce himself. He just slapped on a rear naked. So I reached right back and I gouged his eye. The first thing I did is I gouged his eyes. He's like, "Oh, Gus, what are you doing?" I'm like,
"What are you doing?"
What did you think I was going to do?
Yeah.
I was going to, so it's, part of what you and I train, both ourselves and our students, is it's a reaction. You gotta go. I'm sitting there having eggs and coffee, and I'm suddenly without I'm suddenly got a rear naked choke on me. You got to go do something right away. You can't think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it all depends where your nervous system is too. Like I remember when I came back from the military, like I didn't have like crazy experience, but when you go from like literally, like I was sleep deprived for most of the military, and you're always on edge and all that sort of stuff. And then I come back here, and for a while, like if you snuck up on me, I'm gonna go. And it took a long time for me to like calm down to the point, and people would get mad at me, like, "What the hell?" I'm like, "What? You know what I do? Like, don't sneak up on me." Right. And I think I'm at the point now where I've calmed down a bit. Like I can feel if it's a threat or not, usually. Fortunately, people don't go around sneaking up on you usually. But I think there is that you need to get to the level, because I know some Krav Maga people who their nervous systems are shot. like for whatever reason, and they don't know how not to go 100%.
Sure.
Right. So I think at a
Right.
certain point, you need to be able to realize in that split second, this is not a real threat versus it is. Uh, what do you think about that? From my
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, yeah. It's you know, there's a difference between being paranoid and being vigilant, right?
Yeah.
Paranoid person thinks they're about to be attacked at all times, and they're to use your expression, right? They're just shot. Vigilance is vigilance. I take a look around me, I see what's going on, and I relax because I know I have answers to what I need to do, and I can go on about my day. But yeah, if you're constantly on edge, thinking that any person that turns the corner is going to be an attacker, man, that's a horrible way to live.
Yeah.
I don't recommend it, and I don't want it.
Yeah. Well, as I was talking about like paranoia, like with various students, I'm like, because I think we circle back to that Hollywood thing. Is a lot of people think, even professional martial artists, that people are going to always attack this way because this is the training, like a Filipino Kali martial artist or something like that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Where did I start that story with?
You were going Hollywood.
What?
You were talking about Hollywood.
Before that. This is where you can tell I didn't sleep very well.
You were saying about staying vigilant or paranoid. You were talking about being paranoid. It's not like the movies. That's what you were saying.
Yeah, I totally forgot my point. Well. But yeah, I can go back to the that thing is that I can go on that other tangent where people think that this is how people attack. Oh, now I remember. Is that if people attack like that and they're all sneaky, what I've found is that it's usually a professional doing that. Took me a while. And people always think that someone is going to attack like a professional, say a professional Kali artist or a professional MMA fighter. And my perspective is, listen, if a professional is after you, you've screwed up in your life decision making. Right?
Yeah.
Because you're probably going to die. If you think a professional is after you, you should be in paranoia now because you're like, someone is out to get me who knows how to do it. What did I do wrong? Because everyone always thinks that is going to be their self-defense situation. But really, it's more of someone's just pissed off in the moment and does some big motion and you got to react to it. Right?
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. And, I think what you see if you just follow YouTube and look at all the websites that talk about street fights or real street fights or, those things that are shot from smartphones and closed circuit cameras, most people have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's an amazing display of ineptitude. They're chucking haymakers, they're flailing their bodies. And I don't worry. And I tell my students they shouldn't worry about having Steven Seagal coming after them. This is not your problem. Your problem is not someone like Steven Seagal. Your problem is going to be there's going to be someone that has absolutely little to no training who's pissed at you because you bumped into them and you spilt their beer, and they're going to just chuck a punch at your face because they're half drunk, giving them even less control.
Yeah, which actually circles back to like the policing thing is that's usually the type of people attacking them, and they can barely handle that half the time. And I think the conversation about how Krav Maga is getting bullied a little bit online right now, for lack of a better words, I wouldn't call it bullying, but it's just like that disconnect. When you have professionals talking about the most efficient way to attack professionals, and then they get in the mindset that that's what it is always, and then someone comes along doing something that a basic untrained human being does, and they're like, what the hell? And the assumption is that they can just do what they do against the professionals, which hypothetically is the best of the best. But so let's take wrestling, for example, right? Double leg shoot, or, underhooks, overhooks, amazing tools. And that's your go-to response, and then they had a knife and you didn't see it. And then I always bring that up, and it's like, yes, it's best. It's wrestling is one of the best tools for unarmed combat. If that's your reflex, and they had a knife, you did not address the bending of the elbow. Deep underhook under the armpit. It's an amazingly effective tool, but not if they have a knife in their hand. Now you got stabbed 3, 4, 5 times, right?
Yeah.
It's like
I actually train people I sublet out of a gym, which is a BJJ gym.
Yeah.
So at least 2 or 3 times a week, I actually have a BJJ class happening in front of me. while I'm teaching my private client, and it's cool to watch because you start to see what these guys are doing, and these are some skilled guys I'm training with, and they've invited me in to say they're all cool guys, great guys. We're all super friendly and super accommodating. But when you realize the level of skill they possess, you realize you don't want to be on the ground with these guys.
No.
You don't. It's a bad day. It's a super bad day if these guys are on the ground with you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you just said, if the weapon comes out, even they're going to have trouble.
Yeah. Well, because they don't know what to do. They go to their natural reflex movement, right? And they'll say, it's obvious, grab the arm, the weapon arm. And I'm like, yeah, but if you aren't training that, a lot of people don't think to do that right away, and especially some of the more modern, fancy competition style jiu-jitsu like barambolos and stuff. Right. And it doesn't translate into practical self-defense. And now, like, I had a student, he's about, I don't know, 6'2". He's athlete, although I don't know if I call baseball and athletic. Shots fired. And he finally started doing jiu-jitsu. He is stronger than me. He is faster than me. He's got better response time than me. I have no delusions about my capabilities as a human being. I'm a small, non-athletic instructor. But I rolled with him and I got mount on him so many times because he doesn't know how to move his body for that purpose. And I always tell people, like, that's why you don't go to the ground. You just don't want to deal with that mess. But then I tell the jiu-jitsu guys, like, guys, some of you might be able to do just fine in self-defense, but you're forgetting like what violence is sometimes. And it's not just what you think it is. It's not just the ability to dominate the other person. It's the ability, situational awareness and what's going on. I think there's this really good video on YouTube. I hope it's still up, where this guy has this other person mounted and he's just teeing off on the guy's face from mount. And he's like, it's just so hilarious. He's like, unfortunate. He's like, I'm the champ. I told you I'm the champ. And then I guess the guy's mom or girlfriend comes by. So the guy on the bottom, his mom or girlfriend comes and just soccer kicks the guy in the face. And I'm like, one, that's karma. Knock them out cold. And it's like people, they get tunnel vision on the strategies of like I actually don't like teaching people to be in mount for the street unless they absolutely have to. Like for policing, I'd rather be them in side control because you can get up faster. If you have to push off their face and get up. But the traditional guys or the MMA guys, like, no, mount's where you want to be. Like, is it though? Because you forget about your ability to need to bail now if you have to. You can't do that in mount because as soon as you stand up, if they're aggressive too, they're going to grab something like a leg and you're going to be stuck there for a second.
If they have a buddy about to jump in, they can grab your legs and prevent you from actually getting up on a 1 or 2 count, and now you're a sitting duck with the punch or the kick.
Yeah. Now, do you participate in jiu-jitsu at all, or are you just a casual observer integrating a little bit here and there?
I did BJJ for about 6 months. I had privates with a black belt, and basically he gave me sort of the rules and the tools of the ground, and I looked at it more from a motion standpoint. I wanted to know how to move. So, so from the stripping aspects to getting out of these respective positions, and we started playing a game, and the game would be we would roll with each other, but every other round was rules or no rules.
Yeah. So
if there were rules, it was someone had to tap out. Now, for the record, I never tapped him out. It never happened. I never thought it was going to happen, and I never got it to happen. And he would tap me out typically. I was reasonably defensive, but literally within a minute and 15, minute 30, I was out. I was tapping something. But on the no rules one, it was as soon as I could, go to the throat, go to the eye, go to the groin, go to wrist lock, finger lock, whatnot. If I could get to a stand-up position, that was victory for me. Yeah. And I was able to do that with him more times than not. Yeah. And that wasn't 100%, but it was probably about 70% of the time. 7 out of 10 times I was able to get to a standing position. Yeah. And it's kind of what you were saying, right? It's you do what you train. So you get a black belt in BJJ who's rolling with you, and they do BJJ things, and they think in terms of BJJ rules, and they don't act in a certain way. And it's not to say he's not a great BJJ expert. It's just when you go to no rules, my tendency to go into places that just cause pain immediately was enough to roll him off and me to stand up right away. So
Yeah.
it's just a different process. But I need to get back to it because I haven't done that in a couple of years.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. It's great. It's got a lot of longevity to it. But I'm always having that conversation again, guys. I don't, even though you can kick my ass in jiu-jitsu, I like some of them might be able to beat me in the street. I like, who knows?
Yeah.
But that's why I avoid the fight. It's like who's willing to be violent first. You know, I had a student who was just a dominant human being, and I was showing ground stuff, and then I'm demonstrating something, and so he has me in side control, and he's putting absolute all the pressure that he can put on me, and I'm like, he actually had my neck and head isolated, so I cannot move, right? He's being a bit of a smart off. I couldn't even reach his eye, which would be my normal stance, so I just grabbed his ear and pulled it as hard as I could.
Yep.
And all of a sudden he's like, what are you doing? I'm like, hey, if you want to play, I'll play. Like, This is the only way I'm getting out of this situation is I escalate the violence to a level of comfortable. And then I always remind people, say side control. The good news about side control is in order for them to maintain the position effectively, they can't strike very well. They have to maintain that pressure. So as soon as they posture up to strike, there's your chance. And people always forget that, the timing of everything and the distance.
I remind people that from, again, the no rules conversation that Krav certainly has, biting is okay.
Yeah.
And there have been a couple of occasions where, the way they were rolling on top of me, I had flesh right by my mouth. And again, you don't want to bite your friend, but at the same time, you show it, and it reminds them that that's also a strategy, right? That's a tactic I can use to get you to move, because that is also, it's a primal moment. I'm biting you. You're going to push yourself way off me right away.
Yeah. I with biting is an interesting one. Like I know some instructors who like insist that I'm going to always remind people to bite. And I found like, one, I'm a bit concerned about bloodborne pathogens and other stuff in the modern world. But I sort of saw like that a lot of the human population is never, ever, ever, they just don't have it in them to do that.
Oh, agreed.
And I sort of suss it out like, hey, I want to remind you guys you can bite, but just be careful if you do. And I think those who will do it. Like I bit my girlfriend once just for the hell of it when she was like, had me in a like not hard, just like, I'm reminding you. She's like, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, well, I can't get out of the position, so I just bit you. and it does, as you said, it reminds people. Like even Bruce Lee talks about it. When he bit them in the armbar, and people forget about that. If it's survival, you're gonna do whatever you have to do to get out. I think
most definitely, and that's
could continue.
No, and I think it's got to be it's a no rules. No rules is no rules. And when I talk about this stuff, I'll talk about how you snap a finger, or how you bite a person, how you stick your thumb in someone's eye. And there's a good percentage of my students who they cringe. They go, "Oh my God, how could you?" And then I have to give them something to think about. Like this is someone attacking your daughter, wife, mother. This is someone near and dear to you that if you fail, they die. And then they can kind of put their head there, but it's a hard concept.
Yeah, for some people, like I sort of pick out like, no, they'll do it, because you do get students occasionally who just automatically grab fingers, and I'm like, awesome, you keep that reflex, just don't do it in training because you're gonna break someone's finger. And then other people, they just don't have it in them. I've found, and it's that's where I'm like, listen, you really need to be aware. You need to run. You need to make smart decisions. It's always funny, like the different perspectives. So like, let's say someone has you mounted in the choke, right? I teach a variation of where you single pluck and mitigate their weight. If they're leaning forward, you get them in that soft spot in the throat just to get their weight up for a second. And I show this sometimes, and the jiu-jitsu guys were like, oh yeah, I'll armbar you. I'm like, will you? Like, is that the intent of a rapist or somebody who's mounted choking someone? Are they really thinking about an armbar? I don't think so. It's just such a reflexive response. Oh, you're exposing your arms. They're gonna armbar you. I'm like, yeah, it's there. I don't think that's a threat though, right? In that situation, right? And understanding that mental aspect of what is the mental state of frame of mind of the person attacking.
Yeah.
Right. It's not what you think it is. Yeah.
Right, and it's not a sport, right? We're not in sport mode.
Yeah.
So if when we're in sport mode, I look at a sport as a sport, and therefore I'm looking at measures and countermeasures. So
Yeah.
you give me this, I'll give you that. But if we're under a violent attack for sexual assault, as you were saying, then
Yeah.
that person isn't going to suddenly flip to an armbar. What is that about?
Yeah.
That's the furthest thing from their mind in that moment, because
Yeah.
they're trying to accomplish something, and it had nothing to do with winning a BJJ role.
Yeah. Yeah. Mindset is everything seems to be the theme today. Now, I did want to ask because we're getting to the tail end of COVID. How has that affected business? How have you managed it?
My fortunate business is I'm a one-on-one training guy.
Yeah.
So I took 60 days off as was required by the U.S. government.
Mm.
And after 60 days, I started getting phone calls and texts and emails from my clients going, "I'm good if you are."
Yeah.
And because it's a one-on-one, we all COVID tested ourselves, walked into my gym, and it was just the two of us in a enclosed room. So
Yeah.
I was able to, from June last year, to continue to train people. So I lost a bunch of students, but
Yeah.
I picked up some students who had all this extra time because their jobs suddenly became remote.
Yeah.
So I was able to survive okay. How about you?
I'm okay. Like where I live, it's an interesting. Don't want to say too much so I don't get in trouble, but I think it should be okay. It's that I'm in British Columbia, and British Columbia is a very strange place politically and mentally. Is that on the surface, people talk like, here's the rules, this is what you have to do, but then kind of quietly, everyone is doing something else.
Right.
And I mean, I think it really shows that the COVID panic was way over the top, and I think heads are going to roll about some decisions made all over the world about this. But
Mm-hmm.
we had to stay closed for the first 2 or 3 months,
Mm-hmm.
and I was relatively okay with that because I'm like I just don't know enough about this virus to really make a decision one way or the other. And about within 2 weeks in, I started doing Zoom classes. Now, I don't have a very big student base, so I lost a lot initially, and I was a little panicked. Right? I had to
Mm-hmm.
close one of my other locations, which was probably okay because it wasn't doing very well. It wasn't a good location anyway. Started doing Zoom. Zoom does not work for Krav Maga. It just
No, it
does
doesn't.
not. And a lot of my students were saying the same thing, like, I don't want to do this.
Right.
And I switched for the sake of keeping people active. I'm like, okay, we're doing HIT via Zoom for the first 30 minutes, and then I'm going to remind you of the techniques that we're doing. I just want you to know this is not what I want to be doing. But my goal at that point was I want to keep people active. Like, it's really
Right.
important for me to keep people active. And then, about 3 months in, the government's like, okay, you can open up after the first wave. So we opened up, no problem. People start coming back, start building up. And then, the second or third wave, whatever they want to call it, hits. And all of a sudden they go all draconian again, shut down.
Yeah.
Um, you're going to find that the evidence for these lockdowns didn't exist. And it was all based on political, like the courts in Canada are starting to show that. So,
Mm-hmm.
me being a evidence-based person, I'm very frustrated with governments around the world and scientists around the world who are not being honest about that. So, my strategy, along with the other, let's just say this is BC specific, is we're listening to what they're saying. What rules and regulations do we need to follow to operate? Now, our local government was not making much sense. One week they'd say one thing, the other week they'd say another, and everyone starts to look around and being like, is there a problem here? As in,
Right.
is me operating going to affect my students' health or well-being? And the consistent voice, at least in our community, at least under the radar, I think I can fairly confidently say this publicly now because the courts are basically telling the governments to fuck off, essentially, and I mean that. Is that they realize the health and well-being of their students, it's more important for them to come in and train than any risk they had for COVID, because we're not teaching 80-year-olds. So we're
Mm-hmm.
not teaching at-risk people. We're teaching usually people under 40. And I'm talking about the general martial arts community that had a little bit of common sense. And a lot of schools were open one way or another, even if they weren't supposed to be.
Supposed to be. Yeah.
And yet it did not have any significant effect on the COVID numbers whatsoever. And it really showed the governments are full of shit on this topic at this point. And I know it's a controversial stance to take, but I'm looking at the evidence, and I think we're going to start to see that we've been lied to about a lot of stuff. And so that's the community here. But then you talk about the community in Ontario or Alberta, where for whatever goddamn reason, the governments went full psycho on the rule sets. Now, I know the culture here that the police in this province, off the record, allegedly did not support the rules. And they really did not want to enforce them if they didn't have to, because they're like, this is silly. Now, Ontario is a different situation where you have, because we have the RCMP in BC and the city police, and we have a much more laid back attitude. Like you can see it with the drug stance. The drug stance in BC for a long time, even before legalization, was like, listen, don't be an idiot. If you're not a major drug dealer, we're not going to come after you. Don't be stupid. You go to a place like Ontario and Alberta, and they still sort of had like this old school, like, don't break the law. So you saw in Ontario, they have provincial police, the Ontario Police Force, and city police for the most part. RCMP are some places. Now, who gets the funding? The Ontario Police, it is funded by the provincial government, who has taken the stance of we're going to go authoritarian, lock everything down. And if you understand Ontario politics, it has to do with the fact that Toronto people are anxiety-ridden, left-wing, believe the narrative kind of people. So it's all about the vote. Well, the city police, even Toronto city police, were like, listen, the rules you want us to enforce are against the Constitution. We're not doing that. And then the Ontario police, you saw videos of them just like arresting teenagers or ticketing teenagers for being in a park by themselves. Because who pays their bills? It's the provincial government who has the rule set. So how a school handled COVID in Canada largely depends on which province you're in. Because even though the federal government was saying one thing, our prime minister he's an idiot. And whether they openly say it or not, the provincial leaders kind of have started ignoring him to some degree. And they're kind of just doing their own thing now, which is not good for the Canadian Confederacy. And everyone's pretending like he's such a wonderful person, but he's destroying this country as far as its unity goes. So it really depends. Now, I will say what he did do, which America didn't do, is if your business is affected heavily, they basically handed out a crap load of money, which I took because it's like, listen, you're forcing me to close, so you're paying me to stay closed. Okay, that's free market, fine. I have no problem, because a lot of libertarians will be like, how dare you take that money? And I'm like, well, I don't want to have to take him to court, so I'll take the money because I think that's fair compensation. Now, he's probably going to end up bankrupting our country because he printed out so much money, it's going to be a disaster. It's like that catch-22, right? So I managed to survive because I'm in BC, where we know the politicians are not serious about they're doing it for the Karens at this point. The rules set where I live, at least Ontario and Alberta, they've just decided to go ridiculous. Like I could not stand. I think my school would have closed outright, because even the money that we were given by the government, it's not enough to last a year. It's just not enough. They give you the money to pay the bills that you have to pay and you can't get out of, but they didn't give you extra money to sustain your livelihood. So it's like anyone who was able to stay open somehow and work figured out a way to do it, and anyone who's a by the book rules person basically closed their doors because they couldn't read between the lines, which is, it's complicated. How do I not get sued by the government but pay my bills, right? It's I take it as a self-defense lesson, is what are the rules and what rules can I break? So in like self-defense, if I kill them, am I going to go to jail? Self-defense. But hey, if I kick them in the groin, is that okay? It's like the same sort of concept where I got to realize what I can get away with and not get away with. And your strategy for survival is interesting, the private lesson thing, because I don't think I could do that. I don't think I could teach 28 lessons a week all week long.
It's a different kind of lifestyle. It's a different lifestyle. So it's very myopic, right? Every client has their time with me, and it's 1 hour privates, do it 28 times a week, and it makes for an easy business model because it's all done by appointment.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it makes for a long week too.
Yeah, I have done it on occasion. I think it also depends with like where you live, like New York State and New York surrounding area. There's so much population and there's enough
Yeah,
collective wealth and buried that that model works. In Vancouver, you got to be like the top guy in your field in order for people to want to fork out that kind of cash for private lessons. It's just not the way. Like I remember when the UFC gyms started opening here, you'd get these wealthy Asians who drop like 10 grand on private lesson packages. They never went. They went once. But if
right,
you're a small gym with no brand name behind it, they're not paying you
right.
that kind of money. So I think, LA and New York are great places to run martial arts studio because there's enough population that you're going to get to be able to sustain that kind of model.
Well, I'm actually experimenting right now because I just bought a house down in Tampa, Florida.
Making the move.
It may happen in the next couple of years, but I now have a location I can teach out of,
Yeah.
and I just started doing some marketing down there. And you are entirely correct.
Yeah.
The interest in paying for one-on-one training is nowhere near what it is up here.
Yeah.
But Fairfield County, Connecticut, which is where I train, and Westchester County, New York, are two of the highest per capitas in the country.
Yeah.
So I benefit from that. But you go down to Tampa, and Tampa's got some wealth as well, but it's not up here.
Yeah.
And so the price tag is very different. So I'm actually experimenting with what will my price become, because it can't be what it is up here.
Yeah. And that's an interesting, like the martial arts and business is a nightmare on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Have you always just done privates, or did you try classes, or was that?
So I did group classes for, what was it, almost 10 years. I did groups and privates, and then I sold my group business to my black belt, and he took it over, and he's running that now, and that's more power to him. And so he paid me, a fair sum for that, and the rest just became my lifestyle. It's just I'll jet down to the gym to do a private when I need to, and sometimes I'll go to their home. Sometimes they come to me, and it's just I get to schedule my life a little bit more, I guess, in some ways, but it's a choice. I know some people don't like it, but it's just sort of become my process.
Yeah, that's it's particular in the Krav Maga world is that, I belong to a few organizations under a few things, and they teach you the curriculum, they teach you what to do, and then nobody has any sound universal business advice anywhere to be found. And I see in some of these forums, Krav Maga forums, it's like, how do I make this my living? And then there's just like either generic advice or no advice. And it's not specific to Krav Maga. It's like, it's not. It's the martial arts world. Like a lot of what will work in New York or LA, it does not work here. It just will not. Always so strange. Like when I have been to New York, like people use apps for like restaurants. It's totally normal for people to be willing to use apps. And Vancouver is like a slow to adapt to that. It took me forever to get students to using my app for signing in. But I would always get marketing pitches from these companies like, look what we did to this school, in New York. Look what we did to this school in this place. And then it'll work for you. Trust us. It's a proven model. And I just got to the point where like, no, it won't. And they're like, you need to try it. I'm like, it's not going to work. It doesn't work here. No school has ever had that work here. It's all about community building and word of mouth and Google. That's it for me. But if I go to another place, totally different, right?
It's true, and I've vowed to the Google gods, and I'm paying them my money to kind of get search engine optimized and get my little pay-per-click ads out there, and it's getting me some love. But at the end of the day, you don't close them if the price tag doesn't meet what they're expecting, and it's what they expect for privates is kind of what they pay somebody to help them lift weights, and I'm not that trainer. And that's what they think about. So they think $60 or $80 an hour is, totally fair. And that's not what I'm charging these days. Yeah. So it's a bit of a disconnect.
So imagine living in Vancouver where 60 to $80 an hour is probably at the higher end of, I charge a little bit more, luckily, because there's not many people teaching what I do. So I can get away with it a little bit. I'm $85 to $100 an hour, depending on how many sessions. But
Yeah,
But
sure.
to a lot of people, that's like, I'm not paying that because I can pay a personal trainer like $30. I'm like, yeah, but you're not gonna kick them in the groin during the session, guy. Like,
Exactly.
uh,
Exactly.
I gave up on privates for a long. One, I to be honest, I don't enjoy teaching them all the time, but I gave up on them here because people just didn't want to pay what I thought my time was worth.
Mhm.
Now it's picking up a bit with COVID coming down. I'm getting a lot of requests. I actually found if I approach it, hey, for the same price, I will teach your family or you and a friend. It's actually much better results, I find,
Sure. Sure.
because then they bring in the comfort level of their friend. I don't get beat up nonstop. I find it's actually easier to teach for me, where I can actually look at what they're doing right and wrong, versus if I'm trying not to get spastic white belt to death. You know, I don't know how
Yeah,
that's
I
worked
do
for
the
you,
same
but
thing.
yeah,
Yeah, I do the same thing. I say, look, for the price of what it's you're basically paying for my hour.
yeah.
So if you want to bring a couple people in with you, that's fine. If you get the round robin and work with each other, that's better for me anyway. So it's pretty much the same rep you just gave.
Yeah, yeah. Whatever works in your region. So I think we've covered a fair about amount of topics. Krav Maga, use of force, kind of policing a little bit. Is there anything that you thought you might want to talk about that we didn't and want to get in?
No, I mean, I think we've covered the high points. Certainly, as far as the Krav Maga community and just sort of why we do what we do. I mean, I think it's at the end of the day, like we said earlier, it's one of my talking points always. Um, we are only going to be as effective doing what we do as students are comfortable talking and working on self-defense. And
Yeah.
self-defense is still a very scary topic to so many people. And I had there's a guy down in New York City who's killing it,
Mm,
absolutely killing it. He's got wait lists and he's got college students coming in, and he's printing money.
mm,
And I walked in one day, and I've trained alongside of him, and we compare techniques. And he's a good guy. I said, so tell me, help me understand, because I'm still trying to understand how to get people into the door,
mm.
talking about violence and getting comfortable with this topic of violence. He goes, well, I never talk about violence.
Yeah.
I said, whoa, wait a second. How do you not talk about violence if we're teaching Krav Maga? He goes, I
Yeah.
teach empower. I teach empowerment.
Uh,
Whoa, no. Come on.
yeah.
There is not one without the other, right? You're empowering them against something, and it has to be violence. But you know, whether he's giving me a line of crap or not, he's not. He's killing it down there. So
Yeah.
I am still interested to see how this world that we're living in, which is growing everly more violent, and there's just more unpleasant news on the TV and the newspapers. Whether there's not going to be some greater swell of people wanting to do what we do, because it's not pretty out there.
Yeah, well, it's there's a couple of, because now we got some stuff to talk about, the ethics of teaching properly or teaching to survive, right? And that,
Yes.
not to shit on any specific Krav Maga organization. Something near was saying there's Israeli Krav Maga and there's American Krav Maga, and the joke kind of
Amen.
is the Israelis are the ones that they focus so much on the aggression, and the Americans, and quote, American Krav Maga is often mocking it in the sense that it's a Taibo class, it's a kickboxing class, it's the empowerment class. And I Vancouver is not Hollywood left, but it's I consider myself center right or whatever. I have people who think I'm some right wing nut job, and I'm like, I don't think you have perspective, but okay. Um,
Right.
but I talk about stuff that makes, and I have no shame. I don't care, because violence is violence and it's uncomfortable. And I do get students who come and are like, I don't like what you're saying. I don't like how you're talking about it. This is making me feel uncomfortable. And I'm usually like, well, maybe you should see a therapist first. You're not ready for this.
Right.
And people, for me, the violence is violence. You can sugarcoat it with your theories all you want. A punch in the face is a punch in the face. Someone
Mm-hmm.
wanting to kill you is exactly that. And when you start bringing that reality, like I know I don't get the kind of business I would if I played that sellout kind of a game, and I don't have any. It's a struggle. Obviously, I need to make a living, but my goal is to teach you to defend yourself. And if I lie to you about what that means, I just don't. I can't do it, but a lot of people do. You know.
My daughter was living in Manhattan for a little while, and she was taking a Krav Maga. I told her I'd pay for Krav Maga classes
Yeah.
in New York. I just wanted her to train. She trained
Mm,
with me, But then it'd been a while, so I said, look, if you're living in Manhattan, I want you to train.
Mm.
So she finds a Krav Maga place, and she goes there for weeks and weeks and weeks. She goes, Dad, I need you to come in. I want to train alongside of you. Would you do that with me? I said, sure, just under the one condition that no one there knows I'm an instructor because I don't need that noise.
Yeah.
And she goes, of course. So I walk in, very inconspicuous, doing my thing. So to their credit, they probably had 50 or 60 people in this class. It was huge. Now, the entire class, and I'm not exaggerating at all, it was a 1 hour class of which 49 minutes was basically just Taibo, to use your point. It was hitting a bag, hitting in the air, doing some sit-ups, doing some push-ups, doing some crunches, doing some this, doing some that. And so we all got this huge sweat going, right? We're all, fried physically. And then and it's a Krav Maga black belt, right? He claims he's a black belt. Because, all right, now it's time for us to do some self-defense. And we did choke from the side. And we did it for 7 minutes. And that was the class.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, they got nothing from that class from a self-defense standpoint. But if they're equating a good class as a good sweat, which is what they're trying to redefine the system as, then they did a great job. But there's a lot of that out there.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate. Like there's so much on the internet that get people. I always ask, like, what do you think Krav Maga is? When I remember to. And the best ones are like, I have no idea. I'm here to learn. That's like great. And then the ones who have a really defined idea of what it is usually don't stick around because my some classes I do are like the Israelis where they're just killing each other, and I'm trying to stress their nervous systems. And some beginner classes I'm talking more because I want them to understand the concepts. And it just depends on who's in the class, what the topic matter is of the day. And people come in and they either the ones who expect it to be kickboxing or the ones who expect to be like murdering each other, and it's not that every single class. They're like, I don't want to do it. And I just don't think they're not there to learn self-defense. They're there to learn the idea of self-defense, which they have mistakenly thought it's one thing, but it's not, which translate into good business, obviously, It's the same in like jiu-jitsu. Like you haven't seen it too much yet, but recently you're starting to see accusations of belt factories in jiu-jitsu. Because you can see the schools that produce good competitors are probably teaching more effective stuff than the schools who have 1,000 students. Like there are some schools that do both, right? Atos, that's John Danaher, Renzo Gracie, right? These are guys who know what they're doing. But you look at a lot of other schools, like certain big organizations in both Krav and Jiu-Jitsu now. It's like you see what they're producing, and it's like that's not going to hold up under scrutiny.
Well, again, if our life's purpose, as Krav Maga instructors, is to have the unfortunate moment of one of our students being attacked and having them succeed in getting away, then you have to reorganize how you're teaching. Right? The priority is to make sure they walk away from a fight and get away safe, or as safe as they can be, and that got lost somewhere. And there's a lot of exercise, conditioning, get fit and learn some self-defense at the same time nonsense. And I have no patience for that.
Yeah. Fortunately, that's what makes the money. That's one of the reasons that I want to do this podcast and talk to not just Krav Maga instructors, but just get our voices out there, because I'm seeing just a lot of nonsense, misinterpretation, misunderstanding, people asking people, because I know there's some high-profile people in the States that understand violence very well, and they want to distance themselves from Krav Maga. They're like, listen, I don't want that name on my thing anymore because of what it's becoming in the States. And it's just, I don't know what to tell those people. Sometimes it's because the techniques that you learned are being taught incorrectly, as in they're not thinking about overwhelming the other person's nervous system. They're just teaching the techniques. Sometimes it's because the Israelis have giant egos, and they're like, it works, trust us, it works. And it's like, no, you need to change the technique, guy. Nobody does that anymore. And it's just very unfortunate that Krav Maga is getting this name where you don't want to be attached to it. It's getting that bullshido kind of attitude, and I do not like it. So talking to people like you and getting the perspective of some of us who have a bit of a better idea of how to approach it better, just to try to clarify what that means to people,
Sure.
It's unfortunate. So if people want to, I think that's a good place to end. Krav Maga is about, so you may learn to walk in peace, survive, get out.
Yeah.
And if you're
Yeah.
not learning that, then it's not Krav Maga. I think you muted yourself there accidentally. So if people want to come train with you or get a hold of you, how can they do that?
My website is corporate Krav Maga, all one word.com.
Yeah.
And number is 203-428-5800. That's a U.S. number.
Yeah. Any social media?
I'm trying to build that up. I'm not the best marketing guy in that department, but I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah. Okay. So the website's the place to go, and hopefully it brings you in some post-COVID windfall, getting out there.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for coming on and having a talk with me. And I hope,
for
those who don't know, he found the time today because he just had a shoulder surgery. So I hope the recovery is smooth and you're back to training in no time.
I'm doing my best. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great day.
You as well. Take care.
You're listening to The Warrior's Day. Brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga. Turning lambs into lions.